Right away, no, this isn't a cry for help. I'm not saying the FNAF lore is unsolvable because I've hit a wall or I'm giving up or anything like that, but I think as someone who regularly claims to have solved the FNAF lore and whose main job has been trying to do that for the past 3 years, I'm uniquely qualified to make the claim that the FNAF lore is indeed unsolvable. But like I mentioned in this title, that's not a slash at the quality of the FNAF lore. This isn't a dig at Five Nights at Freddy's at all. Far from it, actually, because I believe the unsolvability of the lore is one of its biggest strengths. So Slices, put on your aprons and let's bake ourselves a theory. Also, I'm gonna try to mellow out this episode. Let me know if you prefer this style or the more energetic hyper style that I kind of leaned into. First things first, we have to narrow down the difference between lore and story, because they are two different things. At least I'll be using them in two very different ways throughout this video. Every game has a story. Yes, every single one, through the creation of them, even all the way back to Pong. Pong, this game, has a story intrinsically in the gameplay. It's a competitive game. The story of the game is you are trying to beat someone else, and whoever has the most points by the end of the game is the winner. The story of Pong is that of competition with a winner and a loser. It's intrinsic to gameplay. Of course, most games, especially modern games, have more complex and convoluted stories than that, telling the player who they are, where they need to go, and the context of the story going on. But this isn't lore, this is story. For the purposes of today's video, lore is a separate category, and while a majority of video games have lore, whereas story is intrinsically linked to gameplay, lore isn't, so some games can completely forego lore. Pong obviously being one of them. Lore is the world, the settings in which a story takes place. In a way, it's story that's unnecessary to the main game. Story that isn't intrinsic to the actions you're taking. Lore is the story that informs the world around you, and maybe the player yourself. You can fully play a game without interacting with the lore at all, and you wouldn't be lost. Maybe wanting to know more, but you wouldn't be confused. Whereas if you tried to play the game without its story, you would just be pushing buttons to see what happened. Now, most games have story and lore to some extent, one of my favorites being Hollow Knight. The basic story is that you are this bug, the Knight, and for whatever reason, you're drawn to this subterranean kingdom to rid it of its infestation of this orange gas, and along the way you find yourself drawn to defeating the Radiance, something that seems to be the cause of this infection. Along the way you meet several NPCs and enemies that enrich the story you're unfolding, but you're never quite sure what's really going on, and you don't need to. As the Knight, all you need to know is where to swing your sword, or nail. However, Hollow Knight does have a very deep and storied lore to it, something that is honestly hard to find in-game and easy to miss. Honestly, I highly recommend watching YouTube channels like Mossbag to learn more about the Hollow Knight lore, but it's lore that you can fully enjoy the game without ever knowing, whereas the story you just find out by playing the game. Typically, when a video game has a story and lore, there's two main categories that it tends to fall into. Either the story will be very complex and intricate, and the lore will be sort of bare bones just to cover the world building, or the story and lore will be similarly complex and convoluted. An example of the former is Celeste, one of my favorite platformers. The lore of Celeste is fairly bare bones. It is primarily just the mountain Celeste, something that many climbers have tried and many climbers have failed. And that's all that there needs to be, because the real story and depth of Celeste is in its characters, the ones you play as and the ones you meet, all of them having interesting and fleshed out character arcs that develop over the course of the game. You, the player character, have an intense and dramatic character arc throughout the entire ascent that feels amazing to play through. It's a beautiful game with a beautiful story and just enough lore to make the world building make sense. The other category of games can be seen very clearly in something like Skyrim. The story of Skyrim is complex and vast. There are hundreds of quests that you can do that form and break relationships, all while attaining one key goal in the back of your mind. It's an insanely long and diverse game to complete, but equally, if not more complex than the story, is the lore of Skyrim, as part of the Elder Scrolls series. The The world of Tamriel is vast and storied and historic and filled throughout various previous games in the franchise, but even just focusing on Skyrim, the world building here is insane. The architecture, the people that you don't need to meet, the people you hear about. There is enough side literature that's just found lying around the game that Brian David Gilbert made an entire Unraveled video just talking about those books. None of them needed to be there. You're not really missing anything if you don't pick a single one up, but that is deep and complex lore. It's a game whose story and lore are equally vast. So why do I bring this up? That was a lot of not Five Nights at Freddy's. Well, I think one of the biggest strengths of Five Nights at Freddy's is that it fits into neither of these two major categories. Now, I'm not going to say that FNAF is the first game to ever do this, but I think they are genuinely a pioneer for focusing on just the lore and having the story be as bare bones as necessary to convey pieces of that lore. The story of FNAF 1 is incredibly basic. You are a night security guard at Freddy Fazbear's Pizza. You're told that the animatronics can get a little quirky at night, and you should protect yourself by keeping them out of the office. It's never intrinsically made clear if they're haunted or just malfunctioning, but you know if they get to you, you'll die. By the end of the game, you learn that your name is Mike Schmidt, and that's really all we get. And that's all you need to know to play that game. That's all the intrinsic story there is. It's reminiscent of older arcade games like Pac-Man, where sure, you're this guy, you eat pellets, and you eat ghosts. That's all you need to know, do your game. But meanwhile, while those arcade games also had similarly lackluster lore, FNAF on the other hand puts all of its eggs into one basket, the lore. It's incredibly complex and hard to parse. Even starting at just FNAF 1, again keeping it focused on this game, there is a lot of lore about what has happened at these restaurants, why these animatronics are attacking us, and why they might be targeting our player. Not to mention, as the series goes on, with drippings of lore through the multimedia landscape that is Five Nights at Freddy's. Rare Easter eggs that hint towards parts of a story you've never been able to see. Vague and artistic 8-bit scenarios of something you've never heard of but think you can guess where it's going. All of these pointing to some deeper story that isn't directly connected to the game at all besides the location. If anything, the games of Five Nights at Freddy's are more so formalities to deliver pieces of lore to the player. Events that happen on the side of the main story that we've never been allowed to see. For most of the franchise, these games don't really have a direct story. You're kind of just doing stuff off to the side. So already, FNAF storytelling focuses on lore differently than most games, and I think that's important to establish when talking about its lore. But what about that lore makes it unsolvable? Of course. Am I too boring for you now, Mark? You know what? Fine. If you're not going to sit with me, I'm just going to have to take some extreme measures. When talking about the unsolvability of the FNAF lore, it truly depends on which games of the franchise you're talking about. The ones that were made by Scott Cawthon directly, or the ones that were written by him and instead made by Steel Wool. The way I see it, when you solve a mystery, you need evidence. And for that evidence to be valuable to you, you need all of it, and some sort of assurance that it's reliable and truthful evidence. So in this definition, things can be unsolvable if you either don't have all the evidence, or the evidence you have is unreliable. The Scott Games era of FNAF leans into the unreliability. And I'm not even talking about Help Wanted yet. I know that that game introduced the idea that FNAF 1 through 6, at the least, are in-universe games made by an unreliable narrator, Steve Snodgrass. Now, to be fair, Help Wanted establishes that those games are replicas of real-life events. But because they are creations, technically everything within them is unreliable. But putting that that aside for a moment, the information in these early FNAF games was already unreliable. We never get direct names of characters, direct notes of what happens, security footage, anything like that at all. The closest we get is one-off first and last names throughout the series, pieces of subtext that is hidden in minigames, newspaper clippings that mention rumors of something happening but nothing directly, and as mentioned before, death minigames whose pixel art is ambiguous at best. Combine that with the multimedia nature of the lore and its several continuities. The vast, overwhelming majority of information we have on William Afton and Henry Emily, the two most important characters in this storyline, come from a series of books that have been confirmed to not take place within the timeline of the games. And at the same time, they are the sources of some of the most crucial information for some of the most important characters in this series. Looking at the first 7 games, you can make assumptions and you can make educated guesses, but you really can't ever truly claim to have guaranteed to have solved a piece of that lore. It's all too ambiguous. But that's just the Scott Games era. The current story of FNAF, being made by Stu Wool, has both of these issues. Starting with the new one, we don't have all the information yet. To solve a mystery, you need all the available evidence in front of you. And the current story arc of Five Nights at Freddy's is about halfway through, it feels like. We don't have all the information, and we likely won't for a long time. Think about the original series of Five Nights at Freddy's, those first 7 games. The majority of questions from FNAF 2 didn't have a good answer until FNAF 6. Sure, you can look at Give Gifts, Give Life and sort of assume what's going on, but we had no idea who any of these people were until at least 5 games later. We didn't even have a solid idea of who the protagonist of FNAF 1 is until Sister Location, the 5th mainline game. And even still, the fact that Mike Schmidt is an alias for Michael Afton is speculation at best. So when we look at the massive amount of information in Security Breach and Help Wanted, while much of it can be pieced together to make some sort of sense, I strongly believe that the majority of it isn't even meant to be solved yet. It's information that we can't act upon because we don't have the answers to it, and answers we've never thought to ask the questions for. I'm almost certain the Nightmare Own plushes is one of those answers. We have a lot of theories on it. FNAF has several theories on what they might mean. I'm starting to think that they might just be a reference to Help Wanted because it's a VR game, and in the current era, Nightmare Own is seen by the public as a creation for the VR games. But both my interpretation and FNAF's theories on it are just speculation. Because to be honest, I think it's a question we haven't thought to ask yet, something that we'll learn within the next couple games to ask. And like I mentioned, there's still a reliability issue on top of all of this. Help Wanted 1 is literally an in-universe VR game, so everything in it is up to suspect. After Cassie puts on the mask in Ruin, she receives an optical nerve chip or something, which distorts her vision. So everything from then on out is technically up to suspect. We're not sure what she's really seeing. If Gregory truly was GGY and working for Glitchtrap before Security Breach, he would have also worn that mask and received that chip, which in turn means everything we see in Security Breach is technically up to suspect if that chip is involved. Even Help Wanted 2, we start the game wearing the Vanny mask, meaning we already have gotten that chip in our minds. And Steel Wool isn't being subtle about this. The entire point of Help Wanted 2 is that nothing is as it seems. So in an environment where we can't trust anything we're seeing, all the evidence we have, which is only a fraction of all the evidence that will eventually be available, is unreliable. So nearing the end of this rant, I hear you. This doesn't sound like a good thing. So far, this sounds like I've been complaining the entire time. If the focus of the games is the lore and not the story, and this lore is so unreliable and piecemeal, why is that something so many people are drawn to? And why have other games attempted it and failed miserably, like Hello Neighbor? Well, it comes down to that exact same lore. For one, we have more than enough of it. Frankly, we almost have too much of it. While yes, there is a lack of reliability in all the information we have from these games, all the information we have is piles and stacks and books worth of information. So much so that there's 3 major wikis for the game, several guides that are all either incomplete or slightly incorrect, and a character encyclopedia that has so many characters that they couldn't get half the facts right, but is still somehow missing half of the major characters. Ugh, I got cat hair in my eye. Even when the real Mark leaves, his shadow remains. But not only that, Five Nights at Freddy's lore mimics real-life mysteries, where we're left to pick up the pieces in the aftermath. The true crime fandom is something that frankly makes me uncomfortable. Like, these are stories about real people and real tragedies that really happened. Why are we commodifying it? I don't like that. However, I do understand the aspect of enjoying the mystery of it all, because that same quality is what's present throughout all of Five Nights at Freddy's. The story is simple and something we don't have to piece together, which is on purpose, because it's just the sieve that's going to deliver the lore to us. The lore is so sporadic and dripped that we are scrambling for any drops we can find. We have no clue what has actually happened in this background story, but we can hear its echoes. We were never invited to the dinner, but we see the crumbs left on the plate. We didn't see the stampede, but we found the footprints in the snow. Literally, one of the most debated pieces of evidence in this series is 3 pixel art footprints, and we as the fans of this fandom have to take these discordant pieces and find connections where there frankly often aren't. The point of Five Nights at Freddy's is its lore and not its individual stories. All the story of the games are side characters trying to survive while the important stuff happens in the background. The point of solving Five Nights at Freddy's lore is like trying to recreate a script for a Broadway show when all you have are the leftover tickets, or dumpster diving at a Michelin star restaurant to try to steal its recipes. We're constantly sifting through the wreckage to look for its blueprints. That's the magnetic draw that FNAF has. It's why this fandom is so voracious for any scrap of information we can find, because we feel like we're constantly so close to that one key piece of information that'll slot in perfectly and explain everything we've been asking about. But at the same time, there's a fear that a different piece of information can come in like a wrecking ball and change the entire thing. And I don't think I've ever experienced a story where I recognize and admit that one piece of information could change everything I thought I knew about it. And it's something that Five Nights at Freddy's has done exceptionally well, because its real story, the lore, is something that's long settled, and we just have to follow the rumor mill to find it. I mean, hell, when I tried to piece together the lore, I literally made a conspiracy board. I know this is a different kind of video than I usually make, but I was thinking about the FNAF lore and I kind of got nostalgic. So I guess take this as a love letter to the series. Now, don't forget to get yourself a Mark plushie. It's long awaited. Frankly, y'all wanted plushies of this little cat since I started making videos, and he's finally here. He's really cute. He's only available for 3 weeks, so make sure you get him while you can. And also, genuinely, let me know if you like this more laid-back style, because I think it's closer to the kind of videos I would want to make, but I also have a duty to uphold the type of content that the people who subscribe here expect, and that's fine. So if you want a more upbeat style, let me know. If you preferred this, let me know. Something in the middle, let me know. And in the meantime, if you want an example of a single piece of information that could recontextualize the entire series, last week I made a video all about the possible retcon we could see in Secret of the Mimic, which you can find right here. If you want your fan art featured on the channel, make sure to share it with #toastart. A huge thank you to the best channel members, the Dough Risers. And until next time, as always, stay toasty slices.